So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining, and welcome to this virtual media launch of the report on the impacts of trade, consumption, and taking of terrestrial migratory species. My name is Aydin Aramluyan. I'm the interim coordinator of the Joint Communication Unit at the Secretariat of the Convention on Migratory Species. This program will begin with a brief presentation of the key findings of the report, followed by a session of questions and answers from the members of the media. Today's speakers are Amy Fraenkel, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Migratory Species, Robert Nasi, the Director General of the Center for International Forestry Research, CIFOR, and the event will be moderated by Ian Redmond, Distinguished Wildlife Biologist and Ambassador for the Convention on Migratory Species. Before handing the floor to Ian, I'd like to mention that the embargo on the press release is now lifted. And to be able to ask your question at the end of the presentation, you have a question and answer button on the right side of your screen on the bottom. Thank you, and very welcome to everyone. Hand it over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Aydin, and thank you for joining us, whether you're in the room or watching on the live YouTube stream. The subject of today's webinar is press launch is a report on wild meat. Now, wild meat is something which it's a kind of politically correct term. It's known in some parts of the world as bushmeat, but some people see that as a slightly derogatory term. In the UK and much of the English-speaking world is known as game. I grew up in a town in Yorkshire called Beverley, and the butcher always had rabbits and pheasant and seasonally ducks and geese, because they were migratory species that were an opportunity for hunters to bag seasonally abundant game. So it's been a part of human existence since before we were human. We've always been predators. And my professional life has been involved with trying to prevent illegal take of wild animals for bushmeat, or in Australia they call it bush tucker. Whatever you call it, if the offtake is greater than the species can sustain, then the species will decline. And what this report demonstrates is that for migratory species, the offtake is often unsustainable, and we're not doing enough to prevent that. But it's more complicated than that, because for many people, killing wild animals is their source of not only food, but livelihood. And the further away you go from the source of the wild animals, the more expensive it becomes. Now, game meat is considered a luxury in Britain and Europe. It's a taste of the countryside, of the kind of food that our ancestors, when they lived in villages, used to do. Those of us who are now living in towns, if you live in a village, it's probably still part of your diet. So how do we control this deep human cultural activity, and some would argue instinct, to hunt and kill wildlife and consume it in a world where there is more and more people and fewer individual animals? So it's a thorny topic. First of all, I'd like to invite Amy Fraenkel, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Migratory Species, to kick off with some slides, I think, from the report. Amy, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian, and thanks also to Robert and the whole team at CIFOR for the incredible work on this report. If you could share the slides, I think we'll start to present a few of the key findings. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, first, just a quick introduction of who we are. So I'm the Executive Secretary of a UN agreement called the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, otherwise known as CMS. We're an environmental treaty of the UN and we provide a global platform for the conservation and sustainable use of migratory animals and their habitats. Now, species that are protected under CMS are either listed in Appendix 1, which is typically used for endangered or critically endangered species, for which taking of them is strictly prohibited with only a few limited exceptions. Species are otherwise listed on Appendix 2, which are nonetheless threatened, but they're not as threatened as these others. And so they're not endangered or critically endangered. And the range states are to adopt international agreements to improve their conservation status. Now, at our Conference of the Parties that met last year, the parties called for this report that we're presenting today, which is contributing, in fact, to the whole decision, because there's a bit more work to still be done, to address the unsustainable use of terrestrial and avian wild meat of migratory species of wild animals. The report focuses on 105 CMS terrestrial species, not on all wild animals and not on even all migratory species. So it's focusing just on those terrestrial species that are protected by our treaty. The reason why we're looking at this is because our species are declining. Despite the protections, many, even most of our listed species are declining, so we need to understand why. Next slide, please. So to walk you through several major findings of the report, and then Robert will go through these again, but with more detail and also about the process for developing this report. The first major finding is that indeed the taking of animals for wild meat consumption is having significant impacts on most terrestrial species that are protected by our treaty, by CMS. Now, why is that important? It's very important because in the past, the common view had been that habitat destruction, for example, from agricultural development, was the bigger issue. But what we've learned is that for some species, direct exploitation, including for wild meat, is likely to be a larger cause of decline than habitat destruction. Now, the second key finding is that wild meat is often a key use and a major driver for legal and illegal hunting. So when we think about hunting, there's various purposes for hunting, but wild meat as the purpose of hunting is what we're finding is a key use and major purpose. The third finding is also quite new, I think, and very important to take away, which is that the taking for domestic use within national borders is in fact a larger concern than international trade for most terrestrial CMS species. Again, why is this important? And the reason is, as I think the media know and around the world, when people think about wildlife issues, they think about international trade. That's what's been in the headlines on poaching and for medicinal purposes, et cetera. But what we have found in this report is that actually it's a bigger concern for protected species under CMS, for the terrestrial species covered in this report, for domestic use, which means that we need to be paying more attention to those uses if we're going to succeed in recovering those species from their current threatened status. The fourth point is that there are a variety of causes or drivers for taking of CMS species for wild meat, one of which is increased urban use as luxury items, which is a growing pressure on the species. So it's not for necessary nutrition, but as a luxury. Finally, a major finding is that the legislation and enforcement of protections for CMS terrestrial mammal species varies across their range. Now, what that means is that these species, why we're even in existence, the Convention on Migratory Species, is in fact where you've got species that move across at least one national boundary, so that we need to have an international cooperation for their conservation. And so if those protections are inconsistent, then we have a major issue to address. Next slide, please. So my last slide, and then we'll hand to Robert, is on another major finding of the report, which is about the relationship of taking of wild species under CMS and the threat of zoonotic diseases, infectious diseases. And again, the report has found that taking of animals for this purpose, in fact, significantly increase the risk of future zoonotic diseases, which are diseases that transmit between animals and humans. The final point is that it's very important when we look at risks from disease that we don't, again, only look at international trade. The fact is there's a lot of taking that's never crosses a national border. And in fact, there are domestic wild meat markets that we need to look at. The findings absolutely do not imply the need for any blanket ban on use of wild meat, especially when considering that some rural communities rely on wild meat for their nutrition and their income. But the final point I want to make is that any use of wild animals should be legal, sustainable, and consider health risks for both humans and wild animals. So thanks, and over to you, Robert, for the next slides.
Thank you, Amy, and I can put my video. Yes. So to realize this work, we gathered and analyzed the hunting or taking information we could find for each of the 105 CMS terrestrial mammal species, and we used the IUCN Red List, which is the world's most comprehensive inventory of the conservation status of species. We use also a systematic literature. We did also a systematic literature review of over 600 academic and peer-reviewed paper and report regarding species use and offtakes, hunting impacts, drivers of hunting legislation, and known zoonotic disease risk. And we also access the key trade database like CITES, LEMIS, traffic database, the wild meat, that where we had recorded information on whether the species was known to be traded or not. And based on that, next slide, please. We were looking at the terrestrial mammal species protected by the CMS in this study. So they cover the range, ungulates, primate, carnivore, elephant, and bats. And we didn't look at birds, but birds also are an important issue on the migratory species, but it's another story. And in terms of the parties in this study, they covered Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Next slide. So, as Amy said, that's one of the key and probably distressful finding is that 98% of the 105 species are threatened by hunting. It's more than a majority. It's almost all. And then you have the example here of the addax that is now left with 100 in the wild. Next. Then you have the couperet that is now extinct in the wild probably, and the population has declined and due to hunting for meat, horn, and medicine. Next. And the growers gorilla, the population has declined about 60% since the mid-90s, and surprisingly, probably due to the main part for hunting for wild meat trade. So next. So another of the key finding is that this wild meat hunting is mainly for domestic rather than international use. There is an international trade, but mostly is for domestic use. And as Amy said, that put this phenomenon or this activity outside of the remit of a convention like CITES or sometimes on other international conventions. So it's a problem, and it's also a problem because then you need to address that differently at the national level, dealing with a very different national or legislation system and very different livelihood and well-being condition. Next slide. Another of the key finding is the increasing risk linked by unregulated wild meat trade and or wildlife trade or future zoonotic disease. I mean, it's sort of about 70% of the disease affecting a human being are from zoonotic origin, and some come from livestock, but quite a number, and some pretty unpleasant come from wild animal, and you can say Ebola, Lassa, Marburg, and there is a significant risk. Of course, I mean, when you trade things that you export disease where in places where they were not existing, and you create the condition for a zoonotic disease to jump into human, and then you end up with a problem like we can call as COVID-19 that we have now, although we don't know from which species the virus has jumped up to us. Next slide. And of course, because it's mostly a domestic problem, it's mostly criminalized in many countries. There are very various legislation, implementable or not implementable, because people hunt for their livelihood. So in some cases, they have no other resource for protein or for income. It becomes very important to have properly designed legislation in terms of hunting or offtake. And these hunting legislation are not adequate now, as you can see, with the 98% of species threatened by hunting. So they need serious revision to become implementable, and then when they are implementable, they need to be enforced. Because as it is now, we have a lot of very good law on paper, but that are fundamentally non-implementable and hence are not enforced and remains on paper. So that's another issue, and that's something that, if I can make a quick aside, we are working with colleagues on WCS, FAO, and CIRAD on the Sustainable Wildlife Management Project, where we have developed a website that explains all the legislation. And I think that's my slide. Back to you, Amy.
Okay, I think there's one last slide. So first, actually, before I come to the recommendations, I also want to make it one point that's important is that the word trade that we use in this report refers to domestic trade. And so it's not about international crossing borders trade. So the trade, for example, that I was referring to on the zoonotic diseases and that Robert just mentioned, it is about the within the national borders, although international trade, unfortunately, illegal trade continues to be obviously another challenge. In terms of recommendations, so we have some very solid guidance coming out of this report. The first is that obviously that this report shows us that we need to be paying greater attention to the domestic use and sale of CMS species if we are to address the threats to their conservation. So that means, number one, it's not just habitat loss, it's direct take is a major problem. And number two, we need to focus at the domestic level and not just on international trade if we're going to succeed. The next is that clearly we need to have a hard look at national legislation, regulations, as well as enforcement efforts to review them, to see if they need updating and strengthening. The third is that, as I mentioned earlier, that the drivers contributing to the illegal or unsustainable use of wildlife for domestic consumption need to be further identified and addressed. And there are numerous drivers. There can be uses that are driven from poverty and hunger. And in that case, as Robert also said, we need to, it might not be of these species, but if there are takings for that purpose of these species, then we have to understand, what's driving it. Are there alternative sources for nutrition? We need to address poverty and food security alongside needing to protect these species. Some of this is, of course, beyond the remit of CMS, which focuses on species, but we work in partnership with many, many organizations around the world. Other drivers, such as unsustainable urban use, which is growing and is projected to grow, which is for luxury. And that is not something that's needed for nutrition. So we need to look at what's driving those markets. Again, the point being, we need sustainable, legal, and healthy, a healthy framework for any use of these species. The fourth finding is that we need to look harder at the zoonotic disease issue and understand more about spillover risks that are associated with taking of animals for wild meat use and trade, and look at what can decrease or increase those risks so that we can fully address them. Finally, we need stronger international cooperation on the issues that I've just mentioned to address the wild meat taking and migratory species. It comes back to the core mandate of CMS, which is to address these species whose range span multiple countries, and we can work together to tackle these issues, just as we have many other issues confronting us. So with that, I think, Ian, we can hand it back to you and open it up for any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. A very clear summary of the problem that we're facing and the need for solutions. And we're looking at this issue in the context of the delayed super year for nature, which should have been last year, and the forthcoming revised Convention on Biodiversity Conference of the Parties, COP15 in China, which is now going to be partially virtual this year in October, and then a face-to-face one next year, all being well. And the forthcoming COP26 of the climate agreement in Glasgow in the UK at the beginning of November. So 2021 is the year where we redefine our relationship with nature. I don't yet see any questions in the Q&A box. I would encourage any journalists attending to use that, although when I tried to say that in the chat box, it seemed like it wasn't enabled. So if the technical people could make sure that that is enabled. But the question I was going to ask, well, particularly Amy, is the CMS is recognized by the CBD as the experts in the conservation of migratory species. With this report in hand, will this feed into the post-2020 biodiversity framework that CBD is negotiating at the moment?
No, thank you, Ian. And yes, the negotiations are on 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under the CBD. And there are drafts already of possible targets and goals that will be agreed to. One area of such goals and targets is in fact on species. And it's important that this report is also taken into account by the negotiators when they think about what those targets should be, since as we're sharing with you today, it's again far beyond international trade as the only threat that is facing the species.
And the world's attention has definitely been focused more through, I think, the success of CITES in harnessing that attention on the international trade, where species are killed and shipped across borders. But when we're dealing with species that of their own volition move back and forth across borders, it raises different challenges. And for the communities who, as I intimated in my opening remarks, see migratory species as a period of seasonal abundance. Traditionally, the waterfowl came back, or the antelope came back, and that was the time where you hunted and laid in stores for the season when they leave. Robert CIFOR's work is deeply involved with the whole livelihoods issue. How do you think we can square this circle of people who see this as a gift from God, the seasonal abundance, and yet now are being told, actually, the offtake is too high, you can't kill as many as you can and ship them to market in a city because they're declining? How are we going to tackle that livelihood issue?
Well, that's a difficult and relevant question. The thing that we cannot do is, unfortunately, what is happening in most of the legislation is to forbid people who hunt without giving them any other alternative. So that's not working. So so we need to work with the people. I mean, and it goes, I think, from starting from environmental awareness in the primary school whenever possible to discussing with them and what could be a proper alternative in terms of so that, or eventually can we develop a co-management system where people use self-regulating quota and think to maintain the population. I know it's not easy and it's not an easy solution, but fundamentally, unless you agree and you develop a solution of this problem with the local people and by providing them something that do not make them worse than they are, you can have all the regulation you want. They are not going to be implemented, and we will end up as the result where we are now.
It is a challenge.
Ian, I see that we are getting some questions, but
Yes, I was just going to read the question from Michael Dystrom.
okay.
Forgive my pronunciation, Michael, if I got that wrong. You ask, can you describe to me the process by which you determine which animals to list with CMS? And therein lies a whole lecture. But Amy, do you want to summarize that briefly?
Yeah, I'll make it, just some of the basic points about this. So we have a process, and we could follow up with more information for the reporter, but we have a process agreed. In fact, at our COP13, we just updated that process. That was last year in India, on how what's the process for listing. But essentially, there are criteria for what need to be considered for listing. A country or set of countries might propose that certain species get listed, and they have to then be considered. They have to meet certain criteria, including the migratory nature of the species, as well as the status, the conservation status. So if a species is doing fine and doesn't need protection, then it would not likely be discussed under our convention for potential listing. Then you get into the question of which appendix to put it on. And as I mentioned in the beginning, for the most endangered species or most threatened, which means they're either endangered or critically endangered, Appendix 1 is likely to be the proposed option, which is the strictest protection if you put it on that appendix. For Appendix 2, it's with a view of taking additional action, having international cooperation to address the conservation status, which is needed for that species. A species could be listed on both, in fact, if in fact it's viewed that there needs to be a real focused stopping of any takes, but also that it would benefit from additional international cooperation. So there's that possibility. We have a scientific council under our, as part of our governing bodies, and they provide advice on any listing proposal that comes forward. And finally, those proposals are to be consulted with other countries who may be impacted. So it's a pretty comprehensive process involving science and policy and a lot of different entities to examine the status of the species and how it would be beneficial to add it to CMS.
Thank you. A very full answer. And it leads me, there isn't another question in the box at the moment, but it leads me to maybe seek clarification for those journalists or viewers who are aware of the CITES Appendix 1 and 2 listings, and a species is either in one or the other. But as you explained under CMS, the similar sounding names have a very different meaning. And there is often some confusion there. But I know that CITES and CMS are collaborating on a number of joint programs. Do you want to say a little bit about that in this context of the taking of wild meat?
Sure. I mean, we closely work with our colleagues at the CITES Secretariat, and in fact, many governments are party to both treaties. And obviously, there are some important overlaps in terms of the drivers for taking of species. So there could be multiple purposes, in fact. So a species that might be taken for poaching and not for meat might still be used for wild meat, or vice versa. You might have a species that's taken, like the addax, for example, for meat, but also for its horns. And it could also, there also are medicinal purposes. So, so there are areas of overlap. The division would come with CMS having a mandate to work on kind of the upstream issues and the domestic issues in terms of the habitat conservation, as well as this issue that we're coming to today, which is really focusing on the domestic taking regulations for taking, not on the trade side of things, and trade and export-import control. So that's what CITES comes in to do. I see you might have another.
Thank you. Yes, Michael has asked another follow-up question, and I think this is probably one for Robert. Can you speak further about how you can tackle the link between wild meat consumption and poverty, particularly in remote communities which border protected wilderness? That's really the crux of the matter for many people.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there is a link between wild meat consumption and poverty. I mean, sort of there is a potential link or risk between the ban of wild meat consumption and dietary or diversity on food security on poor people. But people are not poor because they eat wild meat. I mean, it's fundamentally what you need is to see if you can offer them alternative to their development that are sometimes possible, but sometimes not possible. So it's really a complicated question, but I think in many places, wild meat, and it be it from migratory species or others, is the only way for people to get some cash, and the cash needed to buy some product that will not be accessible otherwise in the nature and the environment, or to pay for school fees or to pay for medicine. So the question is that, again, is how do you substitute this income by something else? And it very much depend on the condition. They are likely to be different if you are in the middle of the DR Congo, or if you are in a relatively already developed place in Southeast Asia. And similarly, in fact, the wildlife condition will be different also.
Yes, I think the link is that many people in poverty see hunting wild animals as a way out of poverty, because they know that people with money in town will buy it. And I have met hunters who cannot feed the good meat to their own kids because it's worth too much.
Yeah,
So they sell the good meat and the kids eat the bits and pieces, or small mammals or something that they catch themselves. And the good meat is very much seen as a valuable product that goes to town. And unless that community has an alternative, then they're not going to stop doing that unless someone actually forces them. And then it's sort of boots and guns enforcing the law against communities in poverty, which is not a good way of approaching it. But some people see that recognition of the ecosystem services provided by those species in their natural habitat might be a way out of poverty if the world were to pay for that.
Ian, if I could come in on the question, just on the question from Michael, just to add that, again, this report is not covering all hunting of all animals, so it's really important to remember what we're looking at are animals that are not doing well. So they're on the treaty because their populations are in decline, in some cases severe decline. So it's not talking about other types of animals for which hunting might be viable in terms of the populations of those animals. So we're not talking about hunting writ large. We're not talking about, that bigger topic. However, I would also say though that the issues of food security, need to be answered with And there are, in fact, to remind the press that we're launching this on the eve of, or not the eve, it's next week, of the UN Summit on Food. So it's a huge effort to look at food systems and how we can address not only feeding the world, but also doing it sustainably because of the contribution of food systems to environmental problems, including, I might add, to the habitat of migratory species. So it is another issue that we tackle and it's very relevant. But the issues, some of these issues are beyond the work of CMS, but just to bring it really back to our focus is, you know, we need to find alternative nutrition and make sure that the taking, if there's taking, is legal and sustainable. That's the bottom line.
It's more complicated than that because if you find alternative to nutrition and people are still poor, I mean, so they will continue hunting to sell the thing to town. So that's, unless we solve this whole issue of lack of opportunity, lack of capacity, lack of thing, is not going to work. And it's true that the report is not looking at all the species, but it's also true that people are not waking up in the morning and say, I'm going to kill a gorilla. They wake up in the morning and they say, I'm going to the forest and kill something. If the something is a wild boar or an invasive species, they will shoot it. If the something is a gorilla, they will shoot it also. So that's the thing that we need to see. Can we find ways to agree with the people that there are some species that you can probably hunt relatively sustainably, and there are some species that you should not hunt. And for that, if you can bring a value, economic value to the species, then it changes the dynamics. I mean, sort of, when you pay $700 or $800 to spend 1 hour close to a group of gorillas, then the value of the gorillas is much more alive than dead. But that cannot be done everywhere.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And as I said earlier, I mean, it's food security, but it's poverty, and it's finding alternative sources of income if there's no sustainable practice in terms of hunting and sale of species.
So you mentioned, Amy, that this report was commissioned last year in the CMS Conference of the Parties hosted by India, which was supposed to be the sort of the curtain opener for a year of UN meetings to redefine our relationship with nature. And then nature bit back. And the way it bit back was through a new and emerging disease, which may or may not have come from directly from a wild animal, but is certainly what wild viruses in other species are implicated. Can we speak a little about the lessons of the last 18 months and how it has, you mentioned, Robert, the value of gorillas to ecotourism. That value has declined enormously because people can't travel at the moment because of all the travel restrictions. And so we need something else. But the risk of zoonotic diseases in markets where many species are butchered and their meat and bodily fluids are mixed, or they're kept in horrible cages where they're stressed and suffering from trauma, and so their immune systems are suppressed. Those are, you couldn't design a better way of encouraging pathogens, viruses, bacteria, parasites to jump species. How are we going to tackle that in the context of migratory species, which might only be in the markets seasonally because they're only there at certain times of the year? I'm throwing this out to either of you if you want to pick up that thought.
If you're asking me the question, I'm not sure I have the answer. But one thing is sure is that if you have the chance or the opportunity to visit one of this market where people are selling wild meat, what you see very often is the sanitary conditions are appalling. And that's the point. I mean, it's sort of the issue is not so much in terms of sanitary condition, the wild meat or the domestic meat for that. A lot of the zoonotic disease come through a domestic animal, is how it is clean or not clean. I mean, so instead of pushing people to be criminalized, hiding in a corner of the market and wallowing in offal and blood and things, provide them a proper condition, proper way to be in a sanitary good condition, and in exchange you say, yeah, but we can provide you that, but as a result, please don't kill gorillas or other threatened species. Maybe we have a beginning, starting of a beginning of a discussion and a reduction of something that ultimately is a huge cost to society for a minimal investment in improving the livelihood of the local people.
Do you want to add anything to that, Amy? Or
Sure. And this is a very complex issue. And in fact, CIFOR and CMS and a number of other organizations put out a joint statement about zoonotic disease. We can also share that with the press as part of this, is called the Cooperative Partnership on Wildlife, to look at these very complex issues of balancing the needs of especially poor, sometimes indigenous peoples and local communities, with also conservation interests and health issues. And so it's, there's quite a number of facets of this where, and also I think Robert's point was that you don't want to drive this kind of trade underground and make it illegal. If what you need to do is look at drivers, and that's one of the key recommendations, is really understand what's driving the use and what can be done to address it, and who are the people, what are the needs of people who are taking these species, what's causing them to do that, and what are some viable alternatives. But then also some of this, again, can be attributed looking at the laws. There might be ambiguity in the law. There might be a lack of capacity of enforcement of the law. So that's a huge part of this as well, is to really look at what are the messages on the ground in terms of what can be taken. Can you take that gorilla or not? And what are the alternatives if you're someone who's interested in or needing to hunt species for nutrition or for sale?
I think you're right when it comes to species that are well known that it's illegal to kill. The legality is a key issue, and getting hunters to respect that is difficult. I wonder if you could say something about fecundity. This might be in your area, Robert, because the species that migrate, perhaps with some exceptions, are mainly species that have a low reproductive rate, small number of offspring, and quite a long generation time, which makes them very vulnerable to hunting. Whereas rodents, large-bodied rodents and small duikers that seem able to withstand heavy hunting don't migrate. So they're not appearing in this list. And those might actually be the solution for the ongoing consumption of wild meat.
Yes, I mean that's the whole question. I mean, that's sort of can you find species that have a reproduction rate and a range big enough so that they can sustain a certain level of hunting pressure, and you have such species. I mean, it's certain you are giving in your introductory examples. Rabbit is such a species, and in some of the forest, some of the small duikers are such species, although at some stage they reach such a hunting pressure that even these species are threatened in some places. The problem is that people are what you call opportunity hunter, or as I said, I mean, it's sort of they want to maximize the cost of the cartridge, or they want to maximize the investment in putting trap, and of course, if you can kill one animal that is 150 kilo of meat with one bullet, it's better than if you kill that for you than if you kill an animal that is 5 kilos. So that's the whole almost complicated issue. I mean, it's sort of, and unless you, as I said, the only way I see it is that you reach an agreement with the people so that they don't shoot protected species or threatened migratory species, as long as you offer them something in exchange. The question is, when you don't have much to offer in exchange, what do you do? One thing we can probably do is admit that in many cases, I mean, there is no actual reason to kill a migratory species or another for wild meat. If you are living in town, you can eat chicken or beef or leg, and so wild meat as a luxury product should be something that is severely controlled and enforced. And similarly, when I see in Europe that people continue killing migratory species under some cultural question, I think it's not acceptable anymore. I mean, it's fundamentally, if your culture sees that you need to see the migratory of ortolan or something like that, I mean, you can watch the animal. You don't need to kill them and put them in a jar.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, and Ian, I think there is another question through your phone, but let me also say that there are some really good success stories, and there's a lot of people working on the ground on looking at conservation alternatives in terms of livelihoods for people and trying to make sure that that there are benefits to people from taking conservation measures of species that otherwise they might use for short-term financial gain or for nutrition. So that's a key point, and it's a key area that I think we need to spend more time focusing on. There's been some incredible conservation stories where things have turned around, where there's been financial incentives to maintain the populations and conserve. There's case studies that are mentioned in this report as well that talk about how changes of legislation have had a definite impact and recovery for species that were on decline. So there is definitely cause for hope here. And again, I think the report very nicely laid out some of those next steps that we need to take. I also want to point out, before you ask the next question, is that our parties asked us to focus not only on terrestrial species, but also on avian species. So this report only focuses on the terrestrial species, and we still have that other task before us to look at the avian issues. But I can say that, CMS already has quite a lot of work on that topic, in particular on the illegal killing of birds is something that is very much a mandate that we have, and we are hoping to undertake that part of the study in the coming year or so.
And the other part of the question from Michael was to do with trends. So Robert, in your survey of the literature, did you get a sense that it's getting worse, or that the measures that have been taken are helping to reduce the impact of the wild meat take?
It's difficult to say because you don't necessarily have all the study that will give you a strong evidence-based science element saying, okay, that there is a trend. Unfortunately, when you see the trend in decline of many species, you don't know if it's because of there is an increasing hunting or pressure, or if simply because of the nature of the species, the species is declining. But by the simple arithmetic that the population increases creates a bigger demand. Cities increase also, creating a bigger demand, and even if people in cities are eating less wild meat than people in the rural area, they are much more numerous, and as a result, we can say that the trend is on an increasing pressure, and for many species we are reaching a threshold where, in fact, population become non-viable unless completely protected or in a zoo, and so that's what we need to stop. And I think that's the reason of why also this question of hunting is becoming a prominent one in some convention like CMS or even CITES, because that was not a prominent. CITES was much more looking at other issue, and then they realized, oh, this wild meat issue is also an important one, and one that is related to the other one, like ivory trade, and I think it's the same for the CMS, and unfortunately, it's not necessarily the same for the public or the government in places where these things are happening. And there is a real work to do in terms of raising the awareness of people in terms of the consequence of doing things in a place where they see that there is suddenly an abundance of animal. Could be an antelope or could be a bird, but fundamentally what they do is creating something that will make that next year there will be no antelope or no bird. And if people understood that, I think we had a way to probably discuss on a more non-confrontational basis in terms of finding solutions.
Yeah, I might actually add also that, in fact, and it's important to note, CMS covers not just protection, but also sustainable use of species. The issue is, to get to a place that you can have some type of adaptive management or regulated use, they have to be not on Appendix 1. So that's the first thing. So, and those tools have yet to really been tested for some of the species. They're certainly used on other species that are not covered by CMS. So it's, I think, an extremely good point that Robert just made, which is it's kind of the tragedy of the commons. And if you don't have a well-regulated system, then you can decimate the populations. The other point I want to make is about the future trends, which are not very positive in terms of the pressures on species. And we know from the 2019 IFIS report, the Global Biodiversity Report, that was done, in fact, by our neighbors here out of the UN in Bonn, Germany. And they found that as many as 1 million species of animals and plants could be going extinct soon, in our lifetimes. And those, of course, include some migratory species. So there's part of the issue is just getting the data and making sure we know what's happening to the natural world. And again, the pressures on those trends. The other being, of course, population growth, and the need for food and income, and what that will do if we don't have, well-regulated, functioning systems in terms of our species, and of course, things that address the root causes of those drivers.
So it seems clear that those people whose livelihood does depend on harvesting wild meat are going to stop if the species that they're harvesting is being overexploited. And the choice is whether they stop now while there's still some left, or in a few years' time when they've all gone. And I think in that time, people would say, well, we need to find alternatives. Let's not wait until the species are extinct. Let's find the alternatives now so that those species can continue to play their role in the ecosystem on which we all depend. I just wonder, in the context of climate change, there is much talk in the media about the need to move towards a more plant-based diet and eat less meat, even if you don't go totally vegetarian or vegan. Do you think that message can be brought into this? If meat is an occasional treat and not an everyday bulk part of your diet, you might reduce the pressure on these vulnerable populations.
I think it's another relevant question, but this report didn't tackle that topic. But I do see there's another just question about why now. Why are we only focusing on this threat now? And I think the main reason is lack of data, growing decline of populations that have led us to wonder what's happening out there on the ground. And again, having a mandate from the CMS parties is very helpful to bring us to focus on this area that really needs more attention. I might also say that we are working for our next meeting of the parties, which will take place in 2023, on actually a comprehensive report on the conservation status of migratory species covered by CMS and beyond, in fact. And that will be very helpful. And this type of report from today will be a very important contribution to it. But that report will go beyond just wild meat. It will look at all pressures on species, including hunting for other purposes, and on habitat, climate change, and other threats that we confront. So there's a lot, I'm very happy to say, more attention looking at what's happening on the ground and what can we do to solve it. And, you know, this kind of report is absolutely vital for us to be able to know what are the right steps to take to turn this around.
We can but hope that the parties who asked for this report will respond to its conclusions by stepping up the efforts to protect these species. I just see another questioning. Oh, no,
maybe Jan, one point that we should not forget also, because we are now talking about the decision that will be taken in the COP15 of the CBD of the COP26 of the UNFCCC, is the point that yes, I mean, sort of, you should not forget also the loss of habitat or proper habitat is also a big threat to migratory species, and then suddenly we should not forget this because this probably some of the decision that will be in terms of land use and land use change, or in terms of conservation, in terms of how many protected area again, could have a large impact also in trying to keep a sufficient enough population of some of the migratory species, even if we cannot tackle completely the question of hunting. So it cannot be, these things cannot be treated separately.
Yeah.
They need to be taken together if we want to save these species.
No, I want to just to echo that and to say, and this is another finding of the report, that the more fragmentation and destruction of habitat there is, and with roads and the road infrastructure that's being planned, for example, the more access people have to previously pristine or harder to reach places. And that contributes to an increase in the trend of taking animals for wild meat, including CMS species. So that is certainly a very definite link between habitat destruction, not only using the habitat, but bringing the people into the habitat. So I think I'm going to hand it back to you, Ian, to bring us to a close. So I'm just being told of our time now.
Yes, well, in fact, I was just going to invite you both to do some closing remarks, but you sort of did that. So I think the report highlights the challenges we face in protecting these species. And we have all these complex interrelated issues to deal with, and it requires international agreements and cooperation. And I guess the collaboration between CMS and CIFOR and the other partners involved, this new wildmeat.org site, is a great source of information, and the increasing recognition that monitoring, collecting the data and then analyzing it is a really important part of conservation. It's increasingly the case around the world that we have better data, but for most species on the planet, we don't know how many there are, we don't know exactly where there are, and we certainly don't have a nice graph that shows the decline or the bottoming out of that decline and the recovery, with only a few exceptions where we have that data. So I guess the take-home message is must do better and perhaps come up with new ideas. As I mentioned earlier, I think payment for ecosystem services that the world must start to do, and paying communities to monitor and protect, rather than at the moment the only money that comes into those rural communities is money from people who want to exploit and kill. So this isn't the moment for talking about regenerative nature, but that has to be the trend that comes out of the reports of CMS, the discussions in Kunming in China at the CBD, and in Glasgow at COP26. We have to move towards a more positive relationship with nature. And I hope this report, from the point of view of migratory species that are still consumed, is a part of that progress towards a better relationship with nature. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Amy, for participating, and thank you for those journalists who fired questions. And for any people watching on YouTube, look up the report. I'm sure it's on the CMS website as we speak.
Thank you to
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all that joined us today.